Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Inside Investing, the show that helps you level up your financial knowledge and sharpen your investing skills. I'm your host, Hiran Amin. Can you imagine a world in which curing rare diseases with a single dose is routine? Or we avoid diseases like cancer altogether by editing our genes? Or AI helps your doctor craft the best treatment plan for you? Some industry watchers believe this isn't so far off. They say we're at the dawn of the genomics age that could radically change the healthcare industry and create massive windfalls for innovative healthcare companies and their investors. We're going to learn about all of these and cutting-edge innovations and how investors can consider gaining exposure to these themes. But before we do so, I want to give a quick tour of our broadcasting platform to help you get the best possible viewing experience. To start off with, today we're going to be broadcasting on two different streams, one onto YouTube as well as our main primary broadcasting stream. Starting with our broadcasting platform here, you have the ability to adjust the viewing experience by clicking on the upper right corner where you have the controls to be able to move the media player to your liking as well as resize it as well. So please have at it. Also, off to the left, we're going to have our resources folder. Now within here, you're going to find a whole slew of information related to ARC's investments. You'll check their website, their social feeds, and their handles. Along with our topic for today, which is on genomic innovation, they have written a white paper, so you'll be able to download that as well and read that one for yourself. We've also had the chance to had a sit down with Kathy earlier this year and talk about AI. And so if you wanted to catch a rewatch of that webinar we hosted with her, you're going to see that link as well as some other ones related to today's topic. Now, besides that, today's show is going to be all about genomic innovations, and I'm sure there's going to be questions as well from our audience members who would want to put it to our guests. So if you want to do so, please look at the Q&A box. That's going to be located off to the right there. Hit your questions at any time during our broadcast today. Hit the submit, and we're going to queue it up when we get to our Q&A portion towards the end of it. Now, for those folks who are tuning into YouTube, if you have a question you'd like to pose, just make sure to check in that description area, and you'll find a link to join our main broadcasting platform where you can avail of some of these resources as well as be able to pose some of your questions there. Now, with that out of the way, let's bring in today's guest speaker and dive into the fascinating topic at hand. Joining us is Brett Winton, Chief Futurist at ARK Invest. ARK Invest is a provider of ETFs focused on disruptive technological innovation, and they're available in Canadian dollars through a partnership with BMO Global Asset Management. Brett, it's great to have you with us, and thank you for taking the time.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
All right. We're going to sink our teeth into our genomics innovation topic in just a moment's time. But before I do so, I just wanted to get to know you a little bit, Brett. Let me start by saying this. I've heard of Chief Executive Officer, Chief Operating Officer, Chief Technology Officer. Your job title is very interesting, though, Chief Futurist. Can you tell us a little bit about what a futurist is and how your research helps guide the ARK investment team?
Sure. So from inception at ARK Invest, where I started as director of research, we focused on disruptive innovation. And we really think that this business cycle is going to be defined by disruptive innovation. The overall rate of economic growth is going to inflect materially upwards. We think 7% real is possible average over the course of this decade. And that's driven by the 5 technology platforms that we focus on: AI, robotics, what we call multi-omics, which we're going to talk about today, energy storage, and public blockchains. And so our process is driven by a top-down perspective on the cost declines of those technologies and the unit economics they're going to unlock that ultimately leads to an expectation that more than 2/3 of equity market cap is going to be attributable to disruptive technologies by 2030. And to drive and audit those forecasts, well, that's my job as the futurist. And then we use those forecasts to inform and drive our bottoms-up underwriting of the underlying securities that we invest in. So it's, how much is multi-omics going to be worth? How much is a cure going to be worth for the average disease and for all rare diseases? And we really think that's going to be something that's in bounds over the course of this decade. At least we'll have line of sight to being able to cure nearly all rare diseases. And so that's the kind of work that I drive. And then that translates into, oh, which companies are coming out with prospective cures? How are they priced in the marketplace? And how do we think they should be priced given how valuable those cures are going to be? And so that's where our great analyst team, Director of Investment Analysis, steps in to populate the portfolio.
So you're doing the overall sort of forecasting, though, to start with, Brett. Like you look at the big picture stuff, and then the investment team kind of you hand it off to them. Tell me about a little bit about your research process. So how do you, what kind of legwork goes into informing you about those predictions or these technological innovations?
Sure. At the technology level, we use something called Wright's Law, which is a cost decline forecasting methodology, which has been shown, and actually I published a paper showing it's a better way to predict future computer cost declines than even Moore's Law was. And so that gets us our expectation for future costs of technology. Then we do what are called unit economic models, where we say at a future cost, what are end buyers going to pay and which end buyers are going to be brought on board. Like sticking within the multiomic space, you can imagine, I mentioned rare diseases. If you were able to develop a drug that was just a prescription drug that is the average amount that is generated by treating a rare disease with drugs, actually the value of that drug would only be around $100 million, which seems like a lot, except that it cost you $1 billion on average to develop a drug. So nobody does it. This is why rare diseases aren't addressed usually, because it costs so much to develop a drug. And then it's, you don't actually, there's not a large patient population you can get. Now, if that drug is, instead of being a standard drug, which kind of only manages the conditions and there's still hospitalizations that go on and people still live a curtailed life, if instead you're delivering a cure to patients, a one-time dose that permanently eradicates the disease, they get to live a normal, healthy life. The present value, the value of that asset in our modeling is actually $2 billion. So you can see how suddenly it becomes on board. And so it's an example where per unit cost, the performance of drug modalities is massively improved. So that's the kind of unit economic case work that we do. Then from there, we evaluate the individual companies. So we score them on people management, culture, product leadership, barriers to entry, ability to execute, and assign a thesis risk score. And we have a 5-year price target at every company level. So we have an expectation for return for the individual companies that's informed and guided by our technology level forecast.
Okay, yeah, that's a lot to unpack there. So thank you for sharing that with us. So let's actually get into some of this stuff that you already chatted through with us, Brett. So you wrote in the white paper back in 2019 that we've passed a key inflection point that set the stage for the genomics revolution in healthcare. What are some of those major developments as you see it?
So it starts, the way I think about what's happening in now we call it multiomics, because it's not just measuring your gene, which is the shared recipe in every cell in your body that allows your body to construct itself, and you pass down half of it to your from your side and half from, in my case, my wife's side to your next kid. And by the way, I had a kid on Saturday, so I'm thinking a lot about biology right now. And it's a miracle. Life is a miracle. Okay, so we call it multiomics because it's not just measuring the genes and being able to read the genes. It's also being able to read which of those genes are expressed in individual cells in the body. And so kind of gene expression analysis is another tool that we use, even at the single cell level. So doing single cell analysis. And even that data of itself is not so useful unless you can also attach it to what's actually going on with the patient. And so we call that the phenome. And that's like, what are the symptoms that you have? What is the healthiness that you have? And that's also being more precisely measured. So across all of those technologies, there are severe cost declines that allow research to better understand what's going on in the body. And there are companies that sell tools that enable that. And so that's kind of the tool space of multiomics. And what's happened is that you've had, even since in the single cell, the ability to do analysis at the single cell level, it's dropped 5-fold over the course of this year in terms of the cost to prepare a library of single cells to analyze them genomically. Right now, those kinds of tests aren't tests that are given to end patients. They're not tests that are necessarily being used clinically, meaning you can't go into a doctor and say, hey, can you take my cancer and do single cell analysis of the cancer? but it's absolutely happening at the research side. And so at a very high level, you have research insights that then have gotten sufficiently inexpensive that then you're able to power kind of better treatments and better diagnostics. So you can better detect what's going on in a patient's body and better actually operate on that condition to make it better. And the thing that's supercharging all of this is the advancements in AI, particularly over the last few years. So AI is undoubtedly accelerating. Actually, it's accelerating faster than any technology that we study. We think that even the models today will become 100 to 1,000 times more powerful within the next 3 years, given how quickly AI is advancing. And if you look across the entire economy, the place where the most data lies, and probably the most misunderstood data, is in the health sector. Health is the largest storer of digital data. And if you've ever been to a doctor, no matter in Canada or the US, you know that that doctor is actually not even reading through your entire file to tell you what he or she thinks is going on. And so actually, if you look, there's a much larger volume of health data, even in a public genomics database of 500,000 individuals, than was used to train these large language models such as GPT-4 and Llama 3.1. So there's a huge opportunity in taking all of this data generated by tools, applying modern AI to it to actually turbocharge the speed at which better diagnostics and better treatments are both developed and delivered to market, ultimately yielding cures for rare and even kind of complex and widespread diseases.
Yeah, it's like a big accelerant that we're seeing, because you alluded to the fact that traditional drug development now is at least a 10-year process, $1 billion plus in costs. So that application is also going to, we talked about the innovations that are coming forward, but it's also going to be integrated into the traditional method, I would assume, as well.
Yeah, so I mean, if you look at, there's a select set of companies that we're focused on that we think are aggressively using AI to accelerate drug development. And it really is something that you have to build from scratch, because you have to build kind of a lab that collects the data off your experiments, that then feeds into your AI model that's owned by these companies, that then allows you to kind of yield either candidate drugs that better plug into the molecular pocket that you're going after. And if you can do that, it means you can give patients less of the drug to still have the same impact. So there's not as much toxicology. And it means you don't need to test it on as many patients to show that it works. And so they can compress. And for some companies, at least on the results they've seen demonstrated so far, that it's a more than 2x compression in the time to get from, hey, this is a drug idea, to this is a drug I'm going to test on humans, and less than half the cost to go through that process. So overall, 40% of drug development costs, roughly, is preclinical, meaning before it goes into humans. So imagine having that cost and having the time to do it. And though it hasn't been demonstrated yet, we think that also, once you're in human trials, you also should be able to go through more quickly and less expensively, because you'll have a more efficacious drug that will fail less often because you don't have to give as much to have an impact, and that you can get through trial quicker because you don't have to spend all your time recruiting patients, because you need a smaller number of patients in order to demonstrate that the drug works. So if you imagine if you think about the overall drug development landscape, there's a set of companies that we believe are getting a better return on their R&D dollars. Every dollar they're spending is going through this process where they get an asset more quickly for less money in. And so does that mean that 10 years and $1 billion turns into 5 years and $500 million? Well, we haven't seen exactly what the endpoint is, because these drugs are just beginning to get to the late stage of clinical trials. But so far, it's very promising. And that would transform. This is an industry that, as a whole, with the exception of being able to sell a lot of COVID vaccines, has had declining returns on R&D for basically 2 decades, since the early 2000s. So it's been an industry that actually hasn't been delivering great ROI for investors. That we think with the power of AI, it's hit a turning point where it's able to deliver kind of much more efficient use of capital, leading to better results for humanity and better results for investors.
Absolutely. We're gonna pick on that in just a moment, but I do want to pick on something you mentioned, Brett. You talked about, how healthcare providers, doctors, and the way that they use AI, maybe even customized treatment plans. So can you tell me about how multi-omics, let me use that term, age will look like for healthcare providers and patients compared to what we've known so far? So if I had to go a traditional visit to a doctor, how is that going to change with multi-omics coming into the picture now and AI?
Sure. I mean, you can see it first in cancer, where right now, for many cancers still, if you get a cancer and you manage to treat it with some kind of medicine that fights it back into remission, the standard of care is still that you come back regularly. It might be every 6 months or every year, and you basically get a fancy camera picture taken of your body, and they look for it. And so it could be an X-ray, it could be an MRI. They're literally looking for a pocket of growing cells that's the cancer that's returned. Now, that it's better than nothing, but as that cancer grows, it actually like sloughs off pieces of DNA into the blood that are the cancer's DNA. And so with what's called minimum residual disease testing, rather than waiting for it to show up in a photo, you can actually detect it in the blood with these multi-omics tools. And you can detect it quite a bit earlier. So depending on the cancer, it can be 10 months to even 20 months before you would otherwise see it emerging on a picture. Now, if you know anything about cancer, you know it's better to see it earlier than it is later, because you want to treat it before it is sending kind of little seeded cancers to the rest of your body. You don't want it to metastasize. And so right now, this is only happening in a minority of late stage cancers, but it's very clear to us that this is going to become likely the way in which cancer is monitored and kept track of for those that have cancer. So that's where, cancer is a pernicious disease. I know everybody has had their lives touched by it in some way, or almost everybody. And it's really hopeful the way in which cancer care is changing. It's also helpful, I think, to understand exactly what we're doing for these tests. Literally, a patient will go in, have a cancer. They'll take a genetic test of the initial cancer to figure out how to treat it. Then to try to detect whether or not it's coming back, they actually take that genetic sample and they develop a custom test for that patient. And they can do that because of the rapidly declining cost in gene synthesis. So they can actually make a custom test for that patient's specific cancer that allows them to detect it in really minute quantities in the blood. And so it really is personalized medicine, and this test is looking for that patient's specific cancer. And that's why it was not something that was possible, even 3 or 4 years ago. It's possible today. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of demand for this. This is growing very rapidly because it just delivers better patient outcomes. And so then the next thing you'll see on the oncology side is, instead of getting a cancer, getting it genetic tested, and then monitoring with blood tests to see if it's coming back, you're actually going to have blood tests, and this is beginning to happen, that are able to detect and screen for cancer, before you go in. And so above a certain age, it's likely that rather than, just like you're advised to get a colonoscopy, and I hope you do it, but many people don't, because it's extremely uncomfortable and it takes a while to schedule, et cetera. Instead, it either in addition to, and potentially in the future, instead, you will get a blood test that's just part of going into your doctor. They take a blood panel and it'll look for a cancer, not just in colon, but probably multiple blood tests that scan for cancer across the body. And then it may even work out where you're doing an early stage, like multi-cancer tests, where it looks for everything. And then if you trigger on one of those, then you'll get a test specific for that cancer that's also a blood result. And so the entire kind of cancer detection journey is going to move from something where it was really people looking in microscopes to see, oh, does this look like cancer, to something where we are actually measuring and looking for the genetic markers that are what causes the cancer to grow out of control. Where instead of saying, oh, that looks like a gazelle, we are measuring the blood of the gazelle and being like, yes, this is gazelle blood. And so therefore you don't have to see the whole creature. You can just get a drop that's sloughed off on like a leaf or something and be like, yeah, there was a gazelle here. And so it means that we should be able to detect these diseases earlier, and then therefore treat them earlier, and then therefore prevent people from getting into later stage cancer where it's metastasizing, where people really get into trouble.
That's fascinating. And so how far are we from commercialization with this, Brad? Like it seems this is the way to go. Is it going to be ubiquitous anytime soon here?
Well, MRD, minimum residual disease testing, is growing very rapidly, on the order of 50% per year for some companies. And so it is clearly doctors are realizing and patients are realizing the benefits of that. For now, it is just approved for later stage cancers, but the companies are doing work to demonstrate it also delivers great impact on earlier stage cancers. And as you can imagine, from a patient perspective, you don't want to have a later stage cancer. So if you there's a lot of patient demand for being able to take these tests and have insurance cover these tests, even if they have an earlier stage cancer. And then on minimum residual disease, you do have to develop these tests for specific cancers and demonstrate that they work. So there's also an expansion area in the number of cancers. The diagnostic side, again, will happen kind of cancer by cancer. There are tests in the marketplace. For instance, GRAIL has a pan-cancer blood diagnostic. It's not quite kind of precise and sensitive enough for doctors and payers to say, yes, widespread, this is something we're going to advise people to do. But, from our perspective, it's somewhat of an inevitability that these tests will get better. And as they get better, it'll bring on board, a market that could be worth, we've estimated it at tens of billions of dollars per year for early stage cancer screening. And it doesn't materially exist today. So there are, for specific cancer indications, there are blood tests that are some approved or in clinical trial. And we think it's going to broaden across the cancer spectrum and probably become standard of care for everybody above a certain age. And the other question, the reason you start doing it at a certain age is it becomes very hard to test for something if it's like very, very uncommon, because your odds of getting a test back that says, hey, you have cancer, when you don't, increase as the underlying kind of incidence rate decreases. So a 25-year-old, it's incredibly unlikely that you have a cancer, though early stage cancer is actually becoming more prevalent. And so these kinds of tests probably aren't going to be on board, at least over the course of this decade. But it could become in the future that it really is like just like anytime you go into, you would probably get cancer screened at, every time you go into the doctor. And when you're 25, maybe you're not going in at all, but at the age of 30, you go in once. And then as you go more frequently, they're doing cancer screenings via blood every time.
Yeah. Interesting future that we obviously have to look into. Let's talk about multi-omics innovation a bit. I know you've talked about some major themes. Let's start with DNA sequencing, Brett. Can you please explain for our viewers exactly what this is and some of the healthcare application this is going to enable?
Sure. So everybody's born with actually the reason you are who you are is the DNA that's in every cell in your body. So you can imagine this is like a recipe for how you build a body. And it preserves information. Your DNA is half contributed by your mom and half contributed by your dad, and the mix of those results in you. So and usually that is faithfully transcribed, as in what was in the mom and in the dad, like combines to make you. And sometimes you get a bad combination of genes from mom and dad that result in disorders and diseases. And sometimes there's been some genetic mutation that happened either in the egg or in the sperm, such that you get a disorder that also results in a rare disease. So the cost of sequencing DNA has fallen precipitously. In the first DNA sequence, it cost around $2 billion to sequence the first genome. That was in 2003, I think is when they finally finished it. It took a long time. And And so you can imagine that's a very expensive test to do. Now it's heading towards $100 per genome. And so for a while, it had crested below $1,000 to sequence a whole human genome and was hovering around the $600 range. We think it's at 100 and going towards 10, maybe in the early 2030s. It could be by 2030. One of the, we think, initial applications that you'll see this in is we're going to go from a state where newborns get tested for genetic diseases, but typically they get tested by doing what's called a genotyping study, where you can imagine DNA is a 3 billion letter kind of sentence. Think of it that way. And with genotyping, you're maybe looking at 50 of those kind of individual pieces or chunks of letters and being like, is there something that's off in any of these 50? But there's just been a paper published that shows actually if you read the whole 3 billion letters, or even only 2% of that actually produces proteins. So even if you read the exome, it's called, which is the 2% that produces proteins, but you read all of them instead of looking for single individual letters, you can detect a lot more rare diseases than we're currently detecting. And so we think that newborn standard of care will shift towards you get a full genome sequence when you're born. And that sequence will ride along with you for your entire life. It's the, this is a germline sequence. So it's the recipe for your body that's in every cell in your body. And so you will get it done and it will help inform your healthcare choices over the course of your life. The reason you want to do it as a newborn is because there are many diseases that show up that the symptoms don't manifest until a little later, but they exist from the start. And so as a parent, you want to know so that you can begin providing care for that disorder before the symptoms even manifest. And increasingly, we think there will be cures for those disorders. And so it will be, and this is a future state, this isn't the present state, it will be, maybe I shouldn't say as easy, but the standard of care will be you test for these rare disorders, and then if one happens to be manifest in your child, you immediately treat it with gene editing to correct it in the organ that it's going to manifest and cause harm. And so that's, now, just to give you a sense of what that would mean, moving to newborn whole genome sequencing versus right now just genotyping. The largest genetic database in the world, or publicly available, is called the UK Biobank, and they have 500,000 patients that have been sequenced and have attached medical records to them. And so I mentioned, but that database is on the order of 40 times larger than the data that was used to train these large language models. Well, as you shift to whole genome sequencing in kind of newborns, that in the US alone is more than 3 million patients per year. And so we think the database, basically the world's genetic database is going to grow exponentially as you do newborn genetic screening, and then therefore our understanding of disease and the direction that and how to treat disease is also going to expand.
Yeah, perfect. Now, I wanted to pick on one thing you mentioned about, like, so this is like a blueprint that we need to figure out, and you can figure out where the kinks are. But you talked about gene editing. Tell me a little bit about that, Brett. What exactly is that technology? And you also mentioned in your white paper CRISPR as well, specifically. So can you talk us through that a bit?
Sure. So CRISPR was, I believe it was discovered in 2014 or thereabouts. And this is a technology that allows you to go to a specific spot on the genome and then do something to it. You could edit that specific spot. You could cut out that specific spot. You could even potentially insert a chunk of genetic material there. And so for genetic disorders, this is very useful. Now, we mentioned it takes roughly 10 years from beginning to develop a treatment to actually getting a treatment into market. Well, lo and behold, the first gene editing based, CRISPR technology is just commercializing, and in fact just reported its first revenue this quarter. This is a cure for sickle cell disease. So sickle cell disease is a blood disorder where your basically blood cells turn into funny shapes and get caught up in your joints, and so they cause horrible pain. People that have the disease in a severe fashion live to an average of 50, have a lifespan of 50 years, and they get hospitalized, multiple times a year. And in fact, for many patients, it's more than $100,000 in costs to just manage the condition. And they live a really kind of their life revolves around managing their condition because it's so disruptive to normal life. And so what this treatment, this sickle cell disease treatment does is they extract the stem cells from the patients. They edit those stem cells outside the body. So they edit the genetic material in it to allow for normal expression of the protein needed to create normal shaped blood. And then they reinfuse it into the patient. And so far, they've demonstrated that these patients are cured for life. So they go from, average lifespan of 50, and, for some patients, it's tens of hospitalizations a year into just being able to live free and clear. And so from a human perspective, it's remarkable. This is an amazing advance, and it's using gene editing to do it. Now, from a business perspective, we also think it's remarkable, and it's helpful to understand what makes it remarkable. So the sickle cell treatment costs around $2.2 million, I think is the list price, which seems expensive, but it's that expensive because you're avoiding all of these hospitalization costs that you would otherwise incur. As in the way in which these cures are priced is an agency in the US, it's called ICER. In the UK, I think it's called NICE. I don't know exactly what they do in Canada, but I'm sure they have a similar one. And they look at what is the cost to manage the condition if we did not have this treatment. Then what happens to the patient's lifespan adjusted for the quality of their life? How much does it extend it? And different geographies have crudely a different number they assign to a life year. In the US, it's roughly yeah. Because it's always cheaper to let somebody die. Like that's, if you, so you have to give some value to life so that payers will pay for it. And so you take the present value of that. So you take all of those future costs you're avoiding, plus the value of all those life years you're delivering, and you say, well, what if I delivered all of that in one dose? Well, that's how they come up with this, in this case, $2.2 million. And the payers are happy to pay it because you're paying for a medicine instead of paying for, really unpredictable costs in the hospitalizations. Hospitalization costs are rising, so you're avoiding all of the rising costs that would probably, stagger into the healthcare system over time. And you're delivering this amazing patient benefit. Now, what's interesting about that, if you, as the manufacturer or the developer of this disease or this cure, get that money up front, it's actually a really attractive business proposition. And I think this is misunderstood by a lot of people. Even, a lot of professional investors on Wall Street don't get this. And because professional investors say, well, actually curing disease might be good for humans, but it's bad for business. I prefer to sell you something over and over and over again, rather than just getting something once. But by pulling forward all of the revenue for that treatment, one, you get revenue up front as opposed to having to wait to get it. So that's valuable. Two, you also avoid the competitive dynamics when the patent expires or when competitive treatments come to market. And so you get to pull revenue that you would otherwise have lost to competition forward into the present. And so we've done work that suggests that imagine I'm coming to market and I have two options. I can either deliver a cure for a disease, or I can deliver something that totally abates the disease. And I just dose it monthly, and I keep dosing it. And I look at what happens to the revenue curves and the competitive dynamics. It turns out that cure for the disease is more than 2 times more valuable than even a precision therapy that effectively cures the disease, but you have to keep going back to the patient and making sure they get prescribed over and over again. And so we think that professional investors don't get this yet, because this hasn't really entered the marketplace yet. This sickle cell disease treatment is the first of what we see as many probable cures for disease, and people don't understand how the revenue dynamics work. So across the therapeutic space, we actually think there are a number of, frankly, assets that are tremendously mispriced, because people have this conception that, oh, it's bad for business to cure disease, but actually it's remarkably good.
Yeah, that's a point we'll hedge on. And I wanted to talk about the third one, last innovation we're going to talk about, and this one is living drugs. Now, this is very different from what we commonly know, because we talked about chemical drugs up front. So tell me about living drugs a little bit, their application, and how do you see those coming into market?
Sure. So I describe what's called an ex vivo therapy, where you are taking cells out of the body and manipulating them, putting them back into the body. So that's an example of a living drug. The next kind of, I'd say, stage in the evolution there is that they are going to inject in vivo gene editing treatments that will go in and just change the body as it operates inside the body. And so that actually has a lot of attractive characteristics. If you're extracting cells, doing something to the cells and bringing them back, that process takes weeks, it could take months, and it is invasive. So for sickle cell disease patients, for the 70,000 severe sickle cell disease patients that this treatment is for, it's worth kind of going through the process because you're getting a cure. But for some other diseases, you'd rather have it happen immediately. And so in vivo gene therapies are really changing your living cells so that they are basically living therapies. And so I'll give you an example. There's a condition called hereditary angioedema. Okay, it's a mouthful. This is a disease that if you have it, there's actually drugs that can manage the condition for you. They don't do much for quality of life, but they do prevent you from dying, which is great. And so you live an average lifespan, but you still have to take them regularly. They have a side effects, and you have these swelling events that the way it would kill you is your airways could close, so you could suffocate, and you have to take an acute therapy that immediately treats those in order to survive. So people with this disease have to always travel around with their medicine with them. Again, it constrains their life. And the cost of the therapy right now, this therapy that just manages the disease, is around $500,000 per year. Actually, there's 3 therapies that do it, around $500,000 per year. So incredibly expensive. And there is a candidate gene editing one-time dose that just reported phase 2 trials that seems to cure 80% of the patients with this disease. So they can avoid $500,000 in annual costs, and they no longer have to, worry about these swelling events, no longer have to go to the hospital to deal with them, no longer have to carry around their acute therapy. And it's a one-time dose. And this is because it's injected directly into the body. It directly changes the genes in the cells in the body, and they're effectively cured. And so we think actually this cure could price at around $3 million. You could call it 2 to 3 million. Which is a great savings to the system. You go from having to pay $500,000 a year for the 23 years of life the person has left to paying $3 million up front. For at least for 70 to 80% of the patients, they might not ever have to go to you and ask for payment for any treatment again. And it's like a remarkably huge market opportunity. There's 7,000 patients in the US with this disease. There's probably double the market opportunity globally. So you take 2 to 3 million and you multiply times 7,000, and you end up with 14 to 20 billion dollars in addressable market for this cure. And this is a rare disease that we weren't really managing. So a living therapy is going to be produced by your own body, where you change the cells in your body, those cells propagate, and lo and behold, you no longer have to be taking $500,000 a year in treatment, and no longer have to be worrying about it and going to the hospital. And this is going to commercialize assuming phase 3 goes well, which there's always a risk that doesn't, in the 2027 timeframes. So there's a number of these living therapies that are in pipeline. They're beginning to report results out of human trial. They look extraordinarily promising, and we think that people don't understand what the revenue curves are going to look like. But once they do, what will be great about that is that then people will realize, hey, we should be doing a lot more of this stuff. There's depending on the source, we think it's around 9 million, but there's a rare disease database that says there's 16 million people in the US with rare diseases. If you were to cure all of them, we think the market opportunity is around $10 trillion. And so this is not a small market. Actually, the cost of managing rare disease exceeds the cost of managing diabetes in the US. It's just fragmented across all of these conditions, so people don't think of it as like a big market. And it's because the cost of developing drugs and the time to develop drugs and the tools we had were so crude that actually it was a hard market to address effectively for drug makers. That seems to have changed. And if it has, then suddenly all of those rare diseases become amazing business opportunities. We're going to cure people and we're going to make a lot of money. That's a way to attract capital. And so we think as the market realizes the value of these treatments, then kind of the leading edge companies that have the CRISPR type technologies that can address them will then be given license by the market to spend a lot more capital to address a lot of these diseases all at once. And their ultimate cash flow opportunity will expand, by orders.
So you talked about the biggest thing there, Brett, just a moment ago. I think for most people that, if they get afflicted with diseases, is the quality of life that we get back that you just ordinarily wouldn't just on a treatment plan. So if genomics does make the foray that it is on the path to do so, what sort of healthcare companies would be the biggest winners and losers in your view?
Yeah, so there's on the cancer side, we think there are leading edge genetic diagnostic companies that are collecting patient information and attaching it to cancer diagnostic tests. And some of them, wrapping it into actual medical information. So just like Tempus AI does cancer diagnostics. They have a great database of patient information, and they're really trying to deliver AI for healthcare for ultimately every American and probably globally as well, where it's not just cancer, but this is the front end you go to understand what's going on with your body. And by the way, that's how it used to be I asked Dr. Google, and when you ask Dr. Google, Dr. Google tells you eventually that you have cancer. Like no matter what your symptoms are, it's like it's probably cancer. So that's the problem with going to like WebMD and doing web searching. You always end up in the kind of unlikely event. If you ask an AI agent like ChatGPT and you describe the symptoms well, like even dumping in doctor's notes, you get a very refined diagnosis of kind of what's going on with your body, what are the potential treatment options, and what are other things you should consider that could also be diagnosed. So we think it's natural that will migrate into a health specific kind of facing entity like Tempus AI. There are others trying to do that. On the minimum residual disease side, or in the cancer diagnostic side, there's a number of companies that are interesting. Guardant is one, Natura is another, who are providing kind of either early stage diagnostics or minimum residual disease testing, or a combination of both. And then those companies are all using tools from the likes of 10x Genomics, which provides the tool to measure gene expression at the single cell level. I described how we use synthetic DNA to create these cancer tests. That's created by a company called Twist, which specializes in creating specific DNA strands synthetically for somebody that wants to do a specific test. And that could be, the diagnostic side, or that could be, pharmaceutical companies that are trying to test specific treatments. On the drug development side, there's a number of large cap players that are trying to do AI drug development, but certainly Recursion and and Absci are two companies that are really trying to tune an AI drug development engine to decrease the cost and decrease the time to market. And then on the cure side, CRISPR Therapeutics is bringing Casgevy to market, which is the cure for sickle cell disease. Intellia is delivered phase 2 results on its hereditary angioedema results. And there are a number of other interesting kind of therapeutic modalities that we think are going to provide really differentiated results relative to what we've seen so far. So that gives you a flavor of the landscape. I would condition all of those statements by saying that this space, more than any other, has incredibly idiosyncratic results, meaning you could have something, if you have a 10-person clinical trial, it's an early stage clinical trial, and one of your 10 patients happens to have a heart attack, even though it has nothing to do with kind of your treatment, or it might not have anything to do with your treatment, you got to pause and make sure it doesn't have anything to do with your treatment. And so then that puts a halt on the timeline to commercialization. It puts a halt on kind of like when cash flows are going to accrue. It may even put the company into distress in terms of their balance sheet. And so I think that from a kind of thinking about assets approach, it is important to have a portfolio approach in multiomics, just because the individual company variance is so wild. And I think that, there's also this overarching thing that I think is going to go on, which is, ultimately, if we have our other needs met, we will want to live forever. And you can already see that like billionaires are spending millions of dollars a year to try to live forever. And so there's like this huge, this market is the only market that won't be diminished by technological deflation due to AI and everything else, because the marginal $1 million that you have, if you have $100 million and you have $101 million, you don't care about that extra $1 million, but you care a lot about living one extra month. And so you'll happily take that $1 million and try to trade it for an extra month. And so kind of as this space develops, there's actually a lot of kind of potential for money pushing into R&D, money pushing into the diagnostic tools to try to discover how to live longer, which is, ultimately, if you have everything, that's what you want to do, because you want to be able to enjoy everything for the rest of your life for a very long time.
Yeah, that's the elixir that we're all looking for, Brett. Let me talk on that point, because you mentioned this. It can take years, many years of innovation, where it's going from the laboratory stage before it gets to commercialization or becomes a medical service or product. Some skeptics, as investors, we're putting our investors' hat on, might argue, it's better to deploy our capital into other technologies that can come to market sooner, less barriers to the market. What would you say to change their mind?
Well, I will say that of all of the innovation assets we invest in, this is the, call it longest duration, as in many of these companies have business models that are predicated on cash flow is out, 5 years. So we need to either raise capital from the market or raise capital from large cap commercialization partners to get to that threshold where we can be cash flow positive and we can deliver, ultimately cash flow to shareholders. And so that means these assets have been, call it, uniquely punished by this market cycle. The rise in interest rates impacted these companies more than any other companies because they had such thin balance sheets. They were so funding sensitive that any marginal change in the cost of funding really hurt their ability to kind of expand upon their strategic opportunities, and has caused a number of them to narrow focus. Some have gone bankrupt. I mean, it's really been a bad 2 years for multiomics companies. Now, we have a macroeconomic view that that's beginning to shift, that there's going to be a change in the interest rate cycle, and that this space has more leverage to that than other sectors, because it was punished so severely for its balance sheet sensitivity over the course of this cycle. In our view, some of these companies are valued at a fraction of 2027 cash flow, as in you can, from an equity investor perspective, you're sticking in $1 and we think you're getting back, on the order of $10, 3 years from now in cash flow, assuming they, hit their commercialization milestones and these treatments monetize in the way that we think that they're going to. And so it's clear that they are marked down to a level where people don't believe this future, at least in many circumstances. And I think an underrated thing that has hurt the space is that it's been a remarkably unfriendly mergers and acquisition environment over the course of this cycle. So this year is, as a share of equity market capitalization, the thinnest M&A environment since 1992. So basically nobody's been buying anything, in part because the US FTC has said nobody can buy anything. And people have been like, fine, we're not going to buy anything. Now, that helps large cap companies that usually buy assets and then mangle them and mess them up, but it hurts small cap companies like multi-omics companies because it means they don't have as much strategic leverage against others. There's no kind of person that would step in and buy the franchise in case they get into trouble. And so it doesn't provide a valuation floor that allows them to be more aggressive with their financial negotiations. We think that has turned around with this election. It's clear that the FTC chair is going to change and that the M&A environment will probably significantly loosen. And so for our preference would not be that the companies that we own get acquired, because then you'd get, an acquisition premium, but we think their franchises are probably more valuable than an acquirer would pay. But even one getting acquired will then signal to the market that the others are more valuable than they're currently valued at. And so you should see all of them trade up in that instance. So that's two, call it tactical reasons why this is an interesting entry point for the strategy. And then from a higher level reason, I mentioned it, our perspective, our strategic perspective, we underwrite these technologies as having the highest rate of growth of all of the 5 technologies that we cover, competitive with robotics actually. And it's because it's such an early stage of understanding the body. More than any of the other technologies we study, every time I learn, about a particular thing that we're doing or how we're using a particular diagnostic, it's clear that it's just the first layer of understanding what's going on with the body. So I mentioned single cell sequencing. Think of it this way. Right now, the cutting edge for understanding what a cancer is in your body is you take the sample and you basically stick it into a blender and blend it up. And then you just read, not the genes from the individual cells, but the genes from the blend of all of the cells. But you can imagine that cancer is populated by a small subpopulation of really dangerous cells and a larger population maybe of cells that you can treat but aren't that dangerous. And you can't see that small population because you're just blending it in the smoothie. You can't taste, the blueberry in the banana orange mishmash that's in there instead. And so single cell sequencing allows us to actually look at the individual cells, which is where cancer actually occurs at the cellular level, and sequence those individual cells. And so you can say, hey, this is a blueberry and we need to treat this. And so we're not doing that yet. It's clear we should be doing that. It's clear that's how we're going to understand and really discover cancers that we didn't know existed. And there's going to be, a remarkable, capital markets appetite for doing that and for extending people's lives. Because ultimately, this is the ultimate luxury purchase. People talk about, there's more wealth inequality than ever, which is probably true. Well, what do you think those very wealthy people are going to want to spend a lot of money on? It's living longer. And that will drive down the costs of these treatments. It'll fund the R&D you need so that everybody can get access to it. And so you get a really big, broad, and meaningful addressable market.
All right. Right. That's all very fascinating stuff. And it's certainly a lot to look forward to today. We're going to leave our interview portion of our conversation for now over here. But we're not done yet. We're going to just open the floor up and take some questions from our viewers. We've got a few queued up already. So ready to hear what our audience wants to know more about there?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So I got a question. This one's coming from Ethan. We're going to queue up here. The question is, how will the big players in town respond to this new change? The new treatment will compete for the same market. Are they worried about the once-in-a-lifetime treatment will bring less revenue to their business? It's almost that idea of a subscription model versus a one-time cost. You as businesses, we like subscription because you have guaranteed revenue streams. So what do you say to this? I know you touched on this a little bit in our interview.
Yeah, no, I think that that large cap pharma, the reason they are large is because they have really large sales forces. Like that is for most large cap pharma, the thing that they are very good at. In fact, typically they're not that great at innovation. They tend to buy in innovation in franchises where they have a great sales force. Like they have a great, I don't know, cystic fibrosis sales force. And so therefore they buy in all the cystic fibrosis drugs because, they have the salesperson going around to the docs that specialize in that and giving them free samples. And so it actually is a little bit of a mismatch to the way they are set up. As in, if you imagine if large cap pharma were looking at two assets and one is a cure and one is ongoing revenue, they probably have more leverage over the person that's developed the ongoing revenue treatment because they can offer more value. They can say, hey, we can get this prescribed and we can keep it getting prescribed. In fact, we can even do it after there's competitors in the market because our sales force is that good. And whereas the cure in many ways could sell itself. You can take the hereditary angioedema patients. If you're facing, just the cost, like just the agony of being worried about, will your insurer still pay for this $500,000 a year treatment? Versus a one-time, you get over the hump with your payer for them to underwrite the treatment and authorize the treatment, and then you do it, and you might be done for good. You don't need a salesperson to really sell you hard on this is a good thing to do. This is something where patients are like, yes, that's what I want to do. And so I think it cuts across one of the vectors of consolidation in the pharma space for a long time, which is that sales force, sales and distribution function. And it's just like taking that a step sideways. I also think that the intersection of AI and drug development might be a mechanism that causes a different vector of consolidation in the space. Because whereas the company with the largest sales force has won over time, now the company with the best tuned data sets and mechanism for turning that data sets into AI models may win. Biotech generally is very fragmented because a scientist discovers something and says, hey, I'm going to commercialize this. Well, he's going to make the most money if he does it, hangs out a shingle and like builds a little small company around it and then, develops and shows it works and then maybe gets acquired out by somebody who can actually has the sales force to sell it. So you end up with lots of fragmentation because there's lots of scientists with good ideas. If the new regime of drug development is actually you have dominant AI models that are getting data, getting more R&D funding because they're deploying it more efficiently, that then generates more data for them. That could become the new mechanism by which kind of the market consolidates, and so you end up with these big AI-driven franchises that are innovation-driven as opposed to sales and marketing-driven.
They're monetizing that data then in that sense, essentially, to create those revenue streams as well. All right. Excellent. Next question we have, this one's coming from Chris. We're obviously just wrapped up with elections. New administration is going to be there at the helm. So you talked about FTC might change because under Trump's policies. This question is related to how do you think Trump's supposed effort to cut the FDA could impact the healthcare sector and genomics tech specifically? So do you have any insight into that?
Yeah, I generally think that kind of the biggest risk to innovation is kind of regulatory constraint, as in, and this is across, if you look at all of the technologies that we've covered, I described our cost decline forecast. Nuclear power is the one that actually failed that forecast because in the 70s, there was, regulatory and political uproar, mostly based around people being scared of being blown up by nuclear bombs, which is a totally justified and reasonable fear, but they transferred that to fear of nuclear power. And so basically kind of bogged down the entire space and turned it into kind of heavily regulated kind of cost plus contractor style plant building, which then actually elevated both carbon dioxide levels and the cost of electricity for all of America, in a way that it shouldn't have. Like we should have much cheaper electricity than we otherwise would. The same, you can imagine that there is if you can get through the FDA quicker, then you can get to a larger patient population quicker. And so you can demonstrate to a much finer degree, like how effective a treatment is or is not quicker. So generally in FDA that allows is more lenient rather than more severe, should allow more treatments to come to market. And you would take the risk that it means that some treatments could come to market that have side effects that are unanticipated, or so it's not like all milk and honey, but it does mean that probably in aggregate the market is larger. I will say that there's in the one important factor that came through the ACA was that insurance providers were not allowed to deny people treatment based on pre-existing conditions. And so that meant that, genetic testing, even if that information is not supposed to be shared, people were more likely to do it because they didn't feel like they would be discriminated against by providers on the basis of like a genetic test. And so if the ACA does get rolled back, that could be negative for the genomic space. I think that particular provision is so popular that it's likely that whatever rollback they do on the ACA, they would probably insert it into another bill to make sure it continues. But that is a risk that we're looking at in terms of the changeover in administration. But at a very high level, the M&A thing is, or unlocking M&A is most important for this space. I think that's the biggest and most immediate impact that we'll see as a result of the election.
Okay, we'll see what's in store for 2025 then. Last question here, Brett, for you that we're going to pick. This is a question coming from Nancy. You talked about that modeling that you use to evaluate the businesses. Could you tell me some of the valuation metrics that you like to use to value biotech stocks?
Yeah, so for biotech stocks, it's really the present value of the assets in the portfolio. So meaning you have a stage 1 drug. Well, it costs a certain amount of money to get through stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. Along the way, you adjust for the probability of failure on each of those stages. And assuming you succeed, you're spending more and more money to get through. And then you have an expectation for what is the revenue curve of the drug going to look like, and the cash flow that's going to accrue. And so you compress all that into the present value, and that's the value of that asset. And then you do it across the entire pipeline. Now, unfortunately, it's actually not a sector that submits very well to like quick and dirty multiples. So you can see the entire space as a whole might trade at 4 times price to sales. This is a blend of large cap pharma and small cap, but clearly some of these companies are pre-revenue, so that's not a useful metric to use. That's more like, for a large cap company, what's the blended average of cash flows you're likely to get off their commercialization franchise, with some maybe boost because of their pipeline, but it's mostly based on this is what the drugs are going to sell and what they're going to generate in terms of revenue. So we think actually the inefficiency is in measuring and valuing the pipeline, particularly given that we think R&D dollars being spent now using AI are actually going to yield a better return than R&D dollars historically have, and cures are going to monetize much better than people really anticipate or forecast. So usually another thing people do is they say, oh, what is the peak sales? And then the value of the drug is a multiple of peak sales. There's a rule of thumb there. And I think it's 5 times or 4 times. But that actually doesn't apply if you have a cure, because you actually might even end up with a much larger peak up front, but then it's a very steep drop off. But if you do all the math, it's peak sales is the wrong way to think about it. It's how much, as an investor, how much cash am I going to get off of this asset entering the marketplace? And so we do that work and then look at what others have done and say, oh, well, this person clearly doesn't understand, or at least doesn't understand this asset the way we think we understand it. And on that basis, we think there's really, really bargain basement discount opportunities, and we'll see if we're right.
Okay, Brett, that is amazing. Well, thank you so much for all those wonderful insights. There's a lot to dive into the biotech space. Time's run up on us, so we're going to leave it there for our conversation today. And thank you to all our audience for joining in. Keep a reminder, if you do want to catch our conversation, we will make this on demand. So be on the lookout in your emails if you do want to catch any part of this interview again there. Along with that, as you step out or leave for this event, don't forget that there is going to be a survey. So let us know your feedback on how you found this event with us, and also what future topics you'd like to learn that you find will be relevant to your investing journey. And then finally, also, we want to say follow us on our socials at TD Direct Investing. We're found on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. So you can check that out in the console space and be able to subscribe to us. And then, of course, as we mentioned earlier in the start, if you want to learn more about the research paper that Brett put together, we have the white paper uploaded. So check it out on the resources folder, and then some on their website as well as their social feeds. They do post and run their own podcast there you can tune into. And the final thought, we will run this show again so that you'll see the next upcoming lineup that we have. So don't forget to tune in to see the next topic that we'll have, and you'll be able to click on the registration link individually at the bottom there to be able to join us. So Brett, once again, thank you so much for your time. It was a real pleasure and really breaking it down for us. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Have more questions? Check out the links to the right and in the description below.